Racist cop pulls over a white driver helping black kids. What the dashcam reveals changes everything. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the quiet streets of Elmsworth, a small, seemingly unremarkable town where appearances often concealed the deeper, more uncomfortable truths beneath. It was the kind of place where everyone claimed to know their neighbor, yet the divisions in the community ran so deep that unspoken rules dictated who belonged where. Evan Harris hadn't expected to find himself at the center of it all. At 28, he was fresh-faced, full of optimism, and determined to make a difference. A high school teacher by profession, Evan had taken a job at Jefferson Middle School 5 years ago, drawn by the opportunity to teach in a diverse community where he thought he could help bridge the gaps between people. What he hadn't anticipated was how much the job and the town would demand of him. Jefferson Middle was an unassuming red brick building that sat on the borderline between the town's east and west sides. The east side was home to working-class families, a majority of them black or Hispanic, while the west side boasted sprawling houses, manicured lawns, and predominantly white residents. The school was one of the few spaces where these two worlds collided, though not without friction. Evan had spent years trying to level the playing field for his students. Kids like Marcus, Tasha, and Caleb had captivated him with their potential, their resilience, and their humor, even in the face of systemic neglect. The school's limited resources meant Evan often spent his own money on classroom supplies and after-school activities, which quickly became safe spaces for students who had nowhere else to go. But for every step forward, there was always resistance. He could feel it in the way some of his colleagues talked about those kids with a thinly veiled condescension, in the way parents from the West Side questioned why their tax dollars were funding programs for others, and in the unspoken assumptions that followed his students wherever they went. It had been a particularly tough week. A community talent showcase was scheduled for Friday night at the town's well-maintained community center on the West Side, a venue none of his students had ever set foot in. Evan had fought tooth and nail to get them on the lineup, only to face more barriers. A lack of transportation, uniforms, and support had all threatened to derail the effort, but Evan was determined not to let his students down. "We're going to show them what you're made of," he had told his small group of performers. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Evan loaded his old beat-up Ford Explorer with musical instruments, props, and a few snacks. The kids piled into the car with a mix of excitement and trepidation. Tasha, a 12-year-old with a voice that could silence an entire room, clutched a notebook of handwritten lyrics to her chest. Caleb, the quiet artist of the group, carried a portfolio of sketches that he had spent weeks perfecting. Marcus, always brimming with energy, had prepared a rap that he swore would blow the roof off the place. "You ready for this?" Evan asked as he started the engine. Tasha gave a small nod. "I think so. What if they don't like us?" Evan glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "It's not about whether they like you. It's about showing them who you are. And who you are is amazing." The drive through Elmsworth was uneventful at first. The kids laughed and joked, their nervous energy bubbling to the surface. But as they crossed the invisible line separating the east and west sides, the atmosphere in the car shifted. The streets here were wider, the houses larger, and the air seemed to hum with a quiet affluence. To the kids, it felt like entering an entirely different world, one where they were painfully out of place. Caleb, who had been silent for most of the drive, finally spoke up. Do you think they'll let us use the front door?" Evan frowned, glancing at the boy in the rearview mirror. "Of course they will. Why wouldn't they?" Caleb shrugged, avoiding Evan's gaze. "Just heard some things." Evan's heart ached at the casual way Caleb said it, as if being excluded or treated as lesser was something he had come to expect. As they turned onto Maple Street, a police cruiser appeared from a side street and began following them. Evan noticed it immediately, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. The laughter in the car faded as the kids noticed too. "Mr. Harris," Marcus said quietly. "Is he following us?" Evan forced a smile. "Probably just heading in the same direction. Don't worry about it." But when the cruiser's lights flashed and the sharp wail of the siren pierced the air, the car fell into an uneasy silence. Evan pulled over to the side of the road, his pulse quickening. "It's okay," he said, more to reassure himself than the kids. "Just stay calm. Let me handle this." The officer who stepped out of the cruiser was tall and broad-shouldered, with a crisp uniform and an expression that could stop anyone in their tracks. Evan recognized him immediately. Officer Grayson, one of the most infamous names among his students. Grayson approached the car with a slow, deliberate gait. He leaned down to the driver's window, his sharp blue eyes scanning the inside of the vehicle before settling on Evan. "License and registration," he said curtly. Evan handed them over without a word, his movements deliberate and measured. "What's going on, officer?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. Grayson ignored the question, flipping through the documents before glancing at the kids in the back seat. "What are you doing out here?" "We're heading to the community center," Evan said, his voice steady. "The kids are performing in the talent showcase tonight." Grayson raised an eyebrow, his lips curving into a faint, humorless smile. "Performing, huh? These your kids?" "They're my students," Evan clarified. Grayson snorted. "Figures." Evan's stomach churned at the insinuation. "I'll need you to step out of the vehicle," Grayson said, gesturing for Evan to get out. Evan hesitated, glancing back at the kids. "It's okay," he said softly before opening the door and stepping out. Grayson led him to the back of the car, his voice low enough that the kids wouldn't hear. "Look, I don't know what you think you're doing, but driving around with a car full of them, not a good look." Evan's jaw tightened. "They're just kids, talented, bright kids, and they're going to the showcase." Grayson chuckled, the sound cold and condescending. "Sure they are. Just be careful, Harris. Kids like that, they've got a way of bringing trouble." Evan stared at him, his anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "Are we done here?" he asked, his voice clipped. Grayson handed back his license and registration. "For now," he said before walking away. Evan climbed back into the car, forcing a smile for the kids. "Everything's fine," he said, though his hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel. The rest of the drive was silent, the earlier excitement replaced with an uneasy tension that lingered long after they arrived at the community center. Evan pulled into the community center's parking lot, the fluorescent lights above casting a stark glow over the asphalt. The building itself was pristine, with its glass windows reflecting the opulence of the West Side. Inside, the muffled sounds of chatter and laughter filtered out through the entrance, a stark contrast to the somber silence that hung in the car. "All right," Evan said, turning to his students. "We're here. Let's show them what you've got." The kids hesitated, their earlier enthusiasm dampened by the encounter with Officer Grayson. Tasha clutched her notebook tighter, while Marcus stared out the window, his usual bravado replaced with quiet apprehension. "They don't want us here," Caleb said softly, almost to himself. Evan's chest tightened. He wanted to tell them they were wrong, that they were welcome, that talent knew no boundaries. But he couldn't ignore the tension in the air, the invisible barriers that made even stepping through the doors feel like an act of defiance. "Listen to me," Evan said, his voice firm but gentle. "You've worked so hard for this. You belong here just as much as anyone else. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Tasha nodded, her expression determined despite the fear in her eyes. Marcus finally looked away from the window, his jaw set. Caleb didn't say anything, but he reached for his portfolio, clutching it like a lifeline. Together, they stepped out of the car and made their way toward the entrance. As they walked, Evan couldn't help but notice the stairs. Parents and students from the West Side, dressed in polished outfits, watched them with a mix of curiosity and disdain. Whispered comments followed them, each one landing like a blow. Who are they? Probably from the East Side. What are they even doing here? Evan kept his head high, leading the kids through the double doors and into the lobby. The interior was just as impressive as the exterior. Gleaming floors, modern decor, and a stage at the far end of the room that was already set for the performances. "Mr. Harris." A woman in a tailored suit approached them, her smile warm but slightly strained. "I'm Karen Thompson, one of the organizers. You must be with the group from Jefferson Middle." "That's right," Evan said, extending a hand. Karen shook it briefly before her gaze shifted to the kids. Her smile faltered for a moment before she quickly recovered. "Welcome. We're so glad you could join us." Tasha, Marcus, and Caleb muttered polite greetings, their discomfort evident. "We'll get you set up backstage," Karen said, gesturing toward a hallway. "The show starts in 30 minutes." As they followed Karen, Evan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being scrutinized. It wasn't just the stares or the whispers, it was the way people moved, the subtle shifts in their expressions, the unspoken judgments that hung in the air. Backstage, the kids busied themselves with last-minute preparations. Tasha hummed softly as she flipped through her notebook, Marcus practiced his rap under his breath, and Caleb sketched furiously, his pencil flying across the page. Evan watched them with a mix of pride and worry. "Mr. Harris?" Tasha's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Yeah? Do you think they'll like us?" Evan crouched down to her level, meeting her gaze. "Tasha, it's not about whether they like you. It's about being true to yourself, and I know you're going to blow them away." She nodded, though her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her notebook. The first few performances were exactly what Evan had expected: polished, rehearsed, and performed by kids who had likely been taking lessons since they could walk. The audience clapped politely, their reactions reserved but approving. When it was finally their turn, Evan felt a surge of nerves. He gave the kids a reassuring smile as they stepped onto the stage, their footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. Tasha was the first to perform. She stood under the spotlight, her notebook clutched in her hands. For a moment, she seemed frozen, her wide eyes scanning the audience. "You've got this," Evan mouthed from the wings. Taking a deep breath, Tasha began to sing. Her voice was soft at first, trembling slightly, but as she continued, it grew stronger, more confident. The lyrics she had written were raw and heartfelt, a reflection of her struggles and dreams. By the time she finished, the audience was silent, their expressions a mix of surprise and awe. Then, slowly, the applause began to build, growing louder until it filled the entire room. Evan felt a lump rise in his throat as he watched Tasha bow, tears shining in her eyes. Next was Marcus. He stepped up to the mic, his usual bravado returning as he launched into his rap. His words were sharp and powerful, painting a vivid picture of life on the East Side. The rhythm of his performance was electric, and by the time he finished, the audience was on their feet, cheering and clapping. Finally, it was Caleb's turn. He stepped forward with his portfolio, his hands trembling slightly as he held it up for the audience to see. The screen behind him displayed his sketches, portraits of his classmates, scenes from their neighborhood, and abstract pieces that spoke to emotions he couldn't put into words. The room was silent as the audience took in his work, their expressions shifting from surprise to admiration. When the kids returned backstage, they were met with hugs and high fives from Evan. "You did it," he said, his voice thick with emotion, but their victory was short-lived. As they gathered their things, Evan noticed a group of parents whispering nearby, their faces twisted with disdain. "I can't believe they let them perform. This is supposed to be a community event, not a charity case. They don't belong here." Evan's hands clenched into fists, but before he could say anything, a voice interrupted. "They belong here just as much as anyone else." Evan turned to see a young woman standing nearby, her gaze fixed on the group of parents. She was dressed simply, her presence unassuming, but her voice carried a quiet strength. "And if you can't see that," she continued, "then maybe you're the ones who don't belong." The parents muttered something under their breath before walking away, their expressions sour. Evan approached the woman, his gratitude evident. "Thank you," he said. She smiled. "It's about time someone stood up to them." Evan leaned against the backstage wall, a wave of relief washing over him as the kids gathered around, their faces lit with a mixture of pride and disbelief. For a brief moment, the applause from the audience had drowned out all the doubts, fears, and prejudice they had faced leading up to this night. Tasha clutched her notebook to her chest, her eyes brimming with happy tears. "They actually liked it," she whispered, almost as if saying it out loud might make it untrue. "They didn't just like it," Marcus said, his usual bravado returning in full force. "We killed it out there." Caleb, ever the quiet one, simply smiled, his hand still holding the portfolio as if it contained his very soul. "It felt good," he said softly. Evan placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "You all did more than good. You proved something tonight, to them and to yourselves." But even as he spoke the words, Evan couldn't ignore the lingering tension in the air. The murmurs from the parents earlier were still fresh in his mind, a reminder that success didn't erase prejudice. The community center had been a microcosm of the larger world, a world that wasn't always ready to celebrate talent when it came from the wrong side of town. As the kids packed up their things, the group of parents who had earlier whispered their disdain stood near the exit, their judgmental gazes fixed on the small group. Evan met their stares head-on, his jaw tightening. "Mr. Harris?" Tasha's voice pulled him back. "Yeah? Can we get ice cream on the way home?" she asked, a hopeful smile breaking through her fatigue. Evan chuckled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "I think you've earned it. Let's celebrate." The drive to the ice cream parlor was filled with laughter and recounting their performances, each of the kids reliving their moment in the spotlight. For a while, it felt like the world outside the car didn't matter. But as they pulled into the brightly lit parking lot of the ice cream shop, reality came rushing back. A police cruiser was parked near the entrance, its presence an unspoken reminder of the invisible lines that divided their community. Evan hesitated for a moment before parking the car. "All right," he said, turning to the kids. "Let's go get that ice cream." Inside, the shop was bustling with activity. Families sat at tables, kids ran around with cones in hand, and the sweet smell of waffle cones filled the air. The kids approached the counter eagerly, their earlier nerves completely forgotten as they debated flavors and toppings. Evan stood back, watching them with a mixture of pride and protectiveness. It was moments like these that reminded him why he had chosen to teach, to give kids like Tasha, Marcus, and Caleb a chance to experience joy and possibility, even in a world that often tried to deny them both. As they waited for their orders, the door to the shop opened and Officer Grayson walked in. Evan's heart sank. Of all the places, of all the nights, why here? The officer's eyes scanned the shop before landing on Evan and the kids. His expression didn't change, but his presence was enough to shift the atmosphere. Conversations quieted, and a few people glanced nervously between the officer and the group. Evan forced himself to stay calm. "Stay together," he said quietly to the kids. Grayson approached the counter, his gaze lingering on the group as he placed his order. The tension was palpable, the cheerful atmosphere of the shop now heavy with unease. "Evening," Grayson said, his voice casual but laced with something unspoken. "Officer," Evan replied, his tone measured. The kids stayed close to Evan, their earlier excitement replaced with wariness. Tasha clutched her ice cream cone tightly, her eyes darting between Evan and the officer. Grayson's gaze shifted to Caleb, who was holding his portfolio. "What's that you've got there, son?" Caleb hesitated, his grip on the portfolio tightening. "It's his artwork," Evan said firmly. "The kids just performed at the community center. They were amazing." Grayson raised an eyebrow. "That's so?" "Yes," Evan replied, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "They've worked hard for this." The officer nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on the group for a moment longer before he turned away. But the damage was done. The festive mood had been replaced with a cold reminder of the barriers they still faced. As they left the shop, Evan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The police cruiser was still parked outside, its presence a silent specter that followed them as they drove back to the east side. The next morning, the kids returned to school, their spirits somewhat restored by the memories of their performance. But the school was no sanctuary. Jefferson Middle was underfunded and overcrowded, with peeling paint on the walls and outdated textbooks that told only half the story of history. In the hallways, Tasha, Marcus, and Caleb faced the same challenges they always had. Whispers, stares, and the occasional snide comment from classmates who thought they were better simply because they lived on the other side of town. But something was different now. The kids carried themselves with a newfound confidence, their performance at the community center a beacon of hope they clung to in the face of adversity. During lunch, Marcus recounted his rap to a small group of friends, his animated gestures drawing laughter and applause. Tasha sat with her notebook, sketching out ideas for a new song, while Caleb showed his sketches to a curious classmate. Evan watched from a distance, a small smile tugging at his lips. He knew their journey was far from over, but he also knew they were stronger than they had been before. However, the peace didn't last. That afternoon, as Evan was preparing for his next class, he received a call from the principal's office. "Mr. Harris, we need you down here," Principal Moore said. Her tone clipped. When Evan arrived, he found Tasha, Marcus, and Caleb sitting in the office, their faces pale and their eyes downcast. Across from them sat Officer Grayson, his expression unreadable. "What's going on?" Evan asked, his voice steady but laced with concern. Grayson held up a piece of paper, a sketch from Caleb's portfolio. It was a drawing of a police car, its sirens blaring as it sped down a dark street. In the background, figures stood with their hands raised, their faces etched with fear. "This was found in his locker," Grayson said, his tone accusatory. Evan's heart sank. "It's a drawing," he said firmly, a reflection of his experiences. "It's more than that," Grayson replied. "It's a statement." "You're damn right it's a statement," Evan shot back, his anger rising. "It's a statement about what these kids go through every day. It's art. It's their truth." Grayson's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, Caleb spoke up, his voice trembling but resolute. "It's not about hate," he said, his words directed at the officer. "It's about fear. It's about feeling powerless." For a moment, the room was silent. Then, slowly, Principal Moore leaned forward. "I think we need to remember why we're here," she said, her tone calm but firm. "This is a school, and these are children. Their voices matter. Their experiences matter." Grayson looked at Caleb, then at Evan, before finally nodding. "Just be careful," he said, his tone softer than before. As the officer left, Evan turned to the kids, his heart aching for them. "You don't have to apologize for who you are," he said. "Never forget that." The story spread like wildfire. Within days, the dashcam footage of Officer Blake's harrowing encounter with Kevin and the kids had taken over news cycles and social media feeds across the country. What started as a local incident in a small southern town turned into a nationwide conversation about systemic racism, police bias, and unexpected acts of heroism. Kevin's world turns upside down. Kevin sat on his couch, staring at the television in disbelief, as another news anchor replayed the dashcam footage for the umpteenth time. The clip showed Officer Blake approaching Kevin's car with unwarranted hostility, accusing him of suspicious behavior simply because he was driving a carload of black kids. But the video also captured Kevin's calm demeanor as he defended the kids, insisting that they deserved better. The breaking point was when Blake reached for his taser, only to be stopped by Kevin's firm voice. "You can treat me any way you want, but you will not harm these kids." The footage ended with the image of Blake stepping back, visibly shaken. "That man stood up for us like nobody ever has," Corey had said in a post-interview, his eyes glistening with gratitude. "He treated us like we were family, not just kids he barely knew, and I'll never forget that." The video didn't just spark outrage, it sparked action. Protests erupted in towns across the state, with citizens demanding accountability from the police department. The hashtag Kevin and the Kids trended nationwide, with thousands of people praising Kevin's bravery and condemning the systemic racism that had nearly led to a tragedy. But for Kevin, the newfound attention was overwhelming. "Man, I didn't sign up to be anyone's hero," Kevin muttered to himself, rubbing his temples. Sitting beside him, his fiancée Maria placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You didn't have to sign up for anything. You did what was right. That's what matters." She turned to the kids, who were sitting cross-legged on the floor, glued to the television. "And now, you're showing these kids what it means to stand up for people who need it most." Corey nodded solemnly. "You're like the dad we never had," he said softly. His younger sister, Layla, squeezed his arm in agreement. The words hit Kevin like a freight train. He'd always been someone who believed in doing the right thing, but hearing the impact he'd had on these kids made everything feel real in a way he hadn't anticipated. Officer Blake faces the music. Meanwhile, the fallout for Officer Blake was swift and severe. Within days of the footage going public, the Jefferson Police Department issued a statement announcing that Blake had been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. But for many in the community, that wasn't enough. At a town hall meeting organized by local activists, residents packed the room to share their stories of mistreatment at the hands of the police. "He pulled me over last year because my taillight was out," one man recounted. "But the way he treated me, you'd think I was a criminal. Another woman shared how Blake had harassed her teenage son for walking home late at night. He saw a black boy in a hoodie and assumed the worst, she said, her voice shaking. As these stories poured out, it became clear that the incident with Kevin and the kids wasn't an isolated event. It was part of a pattern. Blake, for his part, remained silent. But when reporters camped outside his home demanding a statement, he eventually spoke. I was just doing my job, he said tersely. People don't understand the pressure we're under. His words only added fuel to the fire. Back at Kevin's house, the kids were growing restless. They had been staying with him temporarily while their mother, who worked 2 jobs, tried to navigate the sudden media attention. I feel like a caged bird, Corey said one evening as they sat in the backyard. All this attention, and I can't even go outside without people staring at me. Kevin nodded thoughtfully. I know it's tough, but sometimes the hardest battles lead to the biggest changes. He looked at Corey and Layla, his expression serious. You kids have a chance to show people what it's like to walk in your shoes. This isn't just about me, it's about you too. The next day, Kevin surprised the kids by arranging a meeting with a local youth advocacy group. Together, they brainstormed ways to use their newfound platform to create change. We can start by telling our story, Layla said. Not just the bad parts, but the good parts too, like how Kevin didn't give up on us. Corey nodded. And we can talk about how other kids like us deserve the same chances as everyone else. The group agreed to organize a community event where Corey and Layla could share their experiences and invite others to do the same. The community comes together. The event, held at the local recreation center, was a resounding success. Hundreds of people showed up, including local leaders, activists, and families from all walks of life. Corey and Layla took the stage together, their voices trembling at first, but growing stronger as they spoke about their journey. We've been through a lot, Corey said. But this isn't just about us. It's about every kid who's ever felt like they didn't matter because of the color of their skin. Layla added, and it's about the people who stand up for us, like Kevin. He showed us that there are still good people in the world, and now it's our turn to pay it forward. The audience erupted into applause, some people wiping tears from their eyes. But the most surprising moment came when Officer Blake walked into the room. Dressed in plain clothes, he looked nervous as he approached the stage. I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, he began. But after everything that's happened, I've had a lot of time to think. He paused, his voice cracking. I was wrong about so many things, and I want to make it right. The room fell silent as Blake turned to Corey and Layla. I can't undo what I did, but I want to help. If there's anything I can do to support your efforts, I'm here. The kids exchanged a glance, then looked at Kevin, who nodded encouragingly. Everyone deserves a second chance, Corey said finally. Even you. The ripple effect. Over the next few months, the town underwent a transformation. The police department implemented new training programs focused on bias and community engagement, and Officer Blake became an unlikely advocate for reform. Meanwhile, Kevin and the kids continued their advocacy work, sharing their story at schools and community events across the state. Their efforts caught the attention of national media, leading to an invitation to speak at a youth leadership conference in Washington, D.C. As they stood on stage at the conference, looking out at a sea of faces, Kevin couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. We started as a group of strangers thrown together by circumstance, he said. But now we're a family, and together we're proving that change is possible. The audience gave them a standing ovation, their applause echoing through the room like a thunderstorm. A lesson learned. Back in their hometown, life slowly returned to normal. But for Kevin, Corey, and Layla, nothing would ever be quite the same. They had faced the worst of society's flaws and come out stronger, armed with a renewed sense of purpose. And as they sat around the dinner table one evening, laughing and sharing stories, Kevin realized that their journey wasn't just about fighting injustice. It was about finding hope in the unlikeliest of places. The tension in the air seemed to thicken with every passing second. Officer Carson stood in front of David and the children, his hands still on his hips, his jaw clenched in anger. He hadn't expected to be confronted with this situation today, David, then the more frustrated he became. And it was supposed to be a simple traffic stop, something routine, something that should have ended minutes ago. Instead, the boy who had been helping the children had turned the tables on him, and he could feel his grip on control slipping. David, though, didn't waver. He stood tall in the face of the officer's apparent disdain, refusing to let himself shrink into the background. He knew that this moment could very well shape the trajectory of his life and the lives of the children around him. The officer's hostility was more than just a badge of authority. It was a reflection of something far deeper, something systemic and ingrained in society, and David wasn't going to let that go unchallenged. "I don't see why you're so upset, officer," David said, his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest. "I was just trying to help these kids." "Oh, I'm sure you were," Officer Carson sneered, a dangerous edge to his voice. "But this isn't about helping kids, is it? This is about you thinking you can play hero in a place you don't belong." The words stung, but David refused to flinch. The children, standing just behind him, were too scared to speak, but their eyes locked on David with a mix of admiration and concern. They had never seen an adult stand up to an officer like this, let alone a white man stand up for them, a group of young black kids. It was rare, too rare. "I'm just trying to do the right thing," David responded, not letting the officer's aggression throw him off course. "And maybe you should think about doing the same." Officer Carson scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief. "Do the right thing," he repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What, you think helping a bunch of kids is going to make you a hero? Think again." David clenched his fists, but he didn't back down. "It's not about being a hero. It's about doing what's right, something that you clearly don't seem to understand." The children's eyes grew wider, and some of them shifted uncomfortably on their feet, unsure of what to expect next. But David could feel his resolve growing stronger. He wasn't going to let the officer intimidate him. Not now. Not ever. The standoff seemed to stretch on for eternity. The sound of their breathing, the only thing filling the air. David could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on him. This was bigger than just this traffic stop. It was about the larger narrative, the story of racial injustice, of discrimination, and the power dynamics that played out on a daily basis. It wasn't just about one officer. It was about the system that allowed this to happen. The system that allowed a black man to be treated as lesser simply because of his skin color. David's thoughts were interrupted when another voice broke through the silence. "Is there a problem here, officer?" Both David and Officer Carson turned to see Officer Martinez approaching. His uniform was immaculate, his expression calm, but there was something in his eyes that spoke volumes. He had been watching from a distance, and he knew exactly what was going on. "Nothing you need to worry about," Carson snapped, his voice full of aggression. "I'm handling it." Martinez stepped closer, his gaze flickering between Carson and David. "Actually, I think you're done here." His voice was calm but firm, not a hint of doubt in his words. Carson bristled, clearly offended. "You can't just—" "I can," Martinez interrupted, his gaze unflinching. "I'm ordering you to stand down." The words hung in the air, and for a moment it felt as though the world had stopped. Officer Carson looked like he might explode, his fists clenching at his sides, but Martinez stood his ground, never once backing down. "This isn't your call," Carson muttered under his breath. "It is now," Martinez replied, his voice low but filled with undeniable authority. "Let them go." David's heart raced as he watched the scene unfold. This was it. The moment when the balance of power shifted, even if just for a moment. Officer Carson glared at Martinez, but something in his eyes softened. The officer knew that he had lost, and for the first time in this encounter, he seemed unsure of himself. Without another word, Carson turned on his heel and stormed off, disappearing down the street. David let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His knees felt weak, but he remained standing, watching as the children began to slowly relax. Martinez walked over to them, placing a hand on David's shoulder. "You did good," he said quietly. David looked at him, gratitude and disbelief flooding him all at once. "Thank you for stepping in." Martinez nodded. "Sometimes it takes a little bit of courage to make a difference. You showed that today." As the children began to scatter, heading home to tell their families about what had happened, David's heart swelled with pride. He had done the right thing. In a world full of injustice, he had taken a stand. Later that night, as he lay in bed, David couldn't shake the words Carson had said earlier, "You don't belong here." The phrase echoed in his mind, but he refused to let it consume him. He did belong here. He belonged everywhere he chose to be. And no one, not even the authority of a police officer, could take that away from him. The next few days were a blur. The story of what had happened on that street corner began to spread. People whispered about it at work, at school, and in the community. Some saw it as a moment of bravery, a stand against injustice. Others, however, criticized David for interfering with the officer's work. But David didn't care what they thought. He knew what was right. By the end of the week, a few news outlets had caught wind of the incident. David's story was picked up and shared across the town, sparking debates about race, power, and the responsibility of standing up against wrongdoings. There were protests and discussions in local schools, with students and teachers alike asking themselves what they could do to make their town a safer, more inclusive place. David knew that this was just the beginning. The fight wasn't over, and there would be more challenges ahead. But as he thought back to that moment, standing up to Officer Carson, he felt a deep sense of purpose. David had become a symbol of something bigger than himself, a beacon of hope for those who had been silenced for too long. He wasn't just a bystander in a broken system. He was actively trying to change it. And that, David knew, was the most important thing he could do. The days following the confrontation with Officer Carson felt like a whirlwind. David couldn't walk anywhere without hearing whispers about what had happened. Some people congratulated him for standing up to the officer, praising his bravery. Others, though, criticized him for getting involved in something that wasn't his fight, calling him naive or foolish. Yet, amidst all the noise, David found a new sense of purpose. As he sat in his bedroom late one evening, his phone buzzed with a text from his mother, asking if he could join her in the living room. He sighed, knowing what was coming. She had been supportive, but she hadn't fully understood what had happened. It had been hard to explain to her. To many, what David had done seemed like a small act, a brief confrontation. But David knew it was more, much more. He had disrupted something, a system, and no one really knew how it would respond. "Coming," he texted back, setting his phone down and heading downstairs. His mother, a tall woman with strong features and a kind smile, sat on the couch with an unreadable expression on her face. She patted the seat next to her, motioning for him to sit down. He complied, not sure what to expect. "I've been hearing a lot of things," she began. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "About what happened with that officer." David nodded, not wanting to interrupt her. "I didn't mean for it to blow up like this. You know that you can't always just step in like that, right?" she continued, her voice soft but firm. "You can't change the world in one moment, David. I'm not saying what you did wasn't brave, but I'm worried. You might have made yourself a target." David's heart sank and he felt a lump rise in his throat. "I know, Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I couldn't just watch." His mother's eyes softened. "I know, and I'm proud of you for standing up for what's right, but the world, it doesn't always reward that kind of courage." David looked down at his hands, his fingers nervously tapping on his knee. "It wasn't about reward, though. I just wanted to make sure those kids felt safe, you know? I wanted to show them that they matter." His mother let out a long sigh. "I get that, but I've seen the world, David. I've seen how it works. You can't change people's hearts overnight. You can't make them see what they don't want to see." David's eyes met hers, and he could see the sadness in her gaze. She was right in many ways. It wasn't easy to change people's minds. The system was rigged, and there were too many people like Officer Carson who would never see things differently. But David wasn't ready to back down. Not now. "I know it's hard, but we can't stop trying," David said quietly. "Even if the world doesn't reward it, even if it's dangerous, we have to keep going. Because if we don't, who will?" His mother was quiet for a long time, her gaze thoughtful. Finally, she reached over and put a hand on his. "You've always had a big heart, David. I just want you to be careful. There's a lot at stake here." David nodded, but he didn't pull his hand away. He understood his mother's concern. She had always been the one to protect him, to keep him safe, and he knew that she was worried. But the more he thought about what he had done, the more he realized that it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the kids he had stood up for, the ones who had been overlooked for too long. The next morning, David was woken by a loud knock at the door. His mother answered it, and David could hear the voice of someone she didn't recognize. He walked toward the door. Curiosity piqued. When he opened it, he was surprised to find Officer Martinez standing on the other side, a solemn look on his face. The officer greeted his mother politely, but his eyes quickly found David. "David," Officer Martinez said, his voice steady, "can I have a word with you?" David hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Sure." Martinez stepped into the house, and David followed him to the living room. His mother looked at him, confused, but David silently assured her that it was okay. "What's this about?" David asked, sitting on the couch, trying to keep his voice neutral. Officer Martinez took a seat across from him, his expression serious. "I wanted to talk to you about what happened with Officer Carson." David braced himself, his muscles tensing. "What about it?" "I'm not here to tell you that what you did was wrong," Martinez said. "But I want you to understand something. Carson's behavior was unacceptable, and because of you standing up to him, I've been able to file a formal complaint against him. This could change the way he behaves on the job, and it could change the way other officers in this town treat people of color." David's heart skipped a beat. He had known that his actions had made an impact, but this was more than he had ever expected. He hadn't anticipated the system actually listening to him. "Really?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're going to do something about it?" Martinez nodded. "Yes. I know it's not going to fix everything overnight, but you've given me the courage to push for accountability. You've shown me that the system can be challenged. And I'm not the only one who feels this way. Others in the department are beginning to see what's been happening too." David couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had hoped for a change, but this was more than just a personal victory. This was the beginning of a larger shift, one that could have lasting effects on the community. "I don't know what to say," David muttered, feeling overwhelmed. Martinez smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "You don't have to say anything. You did the right thing. That's enough." David sat back in the couch, the weight of the moment settling over him. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he had made a real difference. He had stood up, not just for the children that day, but for the entire community. And in doing so, he had started to change the world. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft amber light across the small suburban street. It was a quiet morning, the kind where everything felt still, almost as if the world itself was holding its breath. The air smelled fresh, crisp from the early dew. But within the car, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Jaden sat in the passenger seat, his thoughts clouded by the weight of the past few days. His encounter with Officer Green had changed everything. It wasn't just the traffic stop, the humiliating accusations, or the way his heart had raced in fear when the officer's hand hovered near his holster. It was the realization that once again, someone saw him as less than human, that he was viewed as a threat simply because of the color of his skin. As the car rolled down the street, Jaden glanced out the window, like his mind racing. The city was bustling with life, people rushing to their daily routines, unaware of the drama unfolding just beneath the surface. It was easy to get lost in the flow of the world, especially when you were someone like Jaden, who had spent years internalizing the notion that he didn't belong. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" his mom, Tamara, asked from the driver's seat, her voice laced with concern. Jaden didn't answer immediately. His fingers tapped the edge of his seat, the nervous energy evident in his body language. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him. This was it, the moment he had been building up to, the moment where he could finally stand up, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever felt like they didn't matter. Tamara had been so supportive since the incident with Officer Green. She had seen the toll it had taken on him, the way it seemed to chip away at his sense of hope, but she also saw something else. She saw the boy who had always believed in doing the right thing, who had always tried to turn the other cheek, who had made peace with a world that didn't always make sense. "I'm ready," Jaden finally said, his voice calm but resolute. "It's time." Tamara nodded, a mixture of pride and worry in her eyes. She had taught Jaden to be brave, to fight for justice, and to never back down. But she had also seen the scars that came from standing up for what was right. It wasn't easy, and sometimes it came with painful consequences. She knew that, but she also knew her son. Jaden wasn't one to shrink away from a challenge. He had fought his whole life to be heard, and now he had an opportunity to make sure others did too. The car turned down the familiar road that led to the town's community center. Jaden had spent hours preparing, rehearsing what he would say, what he would do when he stepped into that room. He had to make his voice count. This wasn't just about one incident. It was about all the countless others that had been swept under the rug. This was about the systemic issues, the generations of people who had been oppressed and silenced. He wasn't just speaking for himself anymore. He was speaking for all of them. As they pulled into the parking lot, the sight of the community center made Jaden's heart race. He could already see the crowd gathering inside. People had been talking about the town hall meeting for weeks. They were finally going to address the issue head on, to demand answers, to demand justice. Jaden's fingers clenched into fists as he stepped out of the car. He was nervous, but more than that, he was determined. Today, he would make sure his voice and the voices of those who had been silenced were heard. They walked toward the entrance, where a few familiar faces greeted them. Tamara exchanged pleasantries, but Jaden was focused on the task ahead. He had spent so long carrying this burden alone, but now he had a chance to share his story with the world. Inside, the room was packed. People from all walks of life had gathered, drawn by the same desire to speak out, to address the deep-seated issues that had plagued their town for years. Jaden scanned the room, his eyes finally resting on the front, where the local officials were seated. Officer Green was there too, sitting at the far end of the table, his expression unreadable. Jaden took a deep breath as his mom led him toward the stage. She gave him one last look of reassurance before she stepped aside. He could hear the murmur of voices in the room, the hushed whispers of people wondering what was going to happen next. The town hall meeting began, with each person given a chance to speak. The tension in the room was palpable as individuals stood up, one by one, sharing their thoughts on the issues at hand. It was a mixture of anger, frustration, and sadness. The room was filled with voices crying out for change, voices that had been ignored for far too long. Finally, it was Jaden's turn. He stood up slowly, feeling the weight of every single eye in the room on him. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he walked to the microphone. The room fell silent. Jaden's voice wavered at first, but he quickly found his strength. He had something to say, and he wasn't going to let anyone stop him. "Good evening," Jaden began, his voice steady now. "My name is Jaden Williams. I'm 16 years old, and I'm here to tell you about something that happened to me, something that happens to people like me every single day." He paused, glancing over at Officer Green, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I was pulled over by Officer Green a few weeks ago. I was driving with my friends, just trying to get home. But for some reason, Officer Green decided that I was a threat. He treated me like I didn't belong. He questioned my every move, even though I hadn't done anything wrong. And when I tried to defend myself, when I tried to explain that I was just a kid trying to get by, he only made it worse. Jaden could feel the anger rising in him again, but he held it back. He had to stay calm. He had to make them understand. This isn't just about me. It's about all the kids who feel like they don't matter. It's about the people who are afraid to speak up because they're scared of what might happen. It's about the system that's failed us, and it's about time we do something about it. His words hung in the air, and for a moment, the room was silent. Then, slowly, one by one, people began to clap. First quietly, then louder, until the whole room was filled with applause. Jaden looked out over the crowd, his eyes filled with tears. He had done it. He had spoken up, and now the world was listening. But it wasn't just the applause that mattered. It was the change that was starting to ripple through the room. The conversations that would take place after this meeting, the ideas that would be shared, the people who would rise up and demand justice. As Jaden stepped off the stage, he was met by his mother, who hugged him tightly. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. "I couldn't have done it without you." Jaden replied, his voice thick with emotion. The room had changed, and so had Jaden. He had taken the first step in a long journey, one that would be difficult but necessary. He had raised his voice, and now the world had no choice but to hear it. This was only the beginning. If you found this story impactful, don't forget to like, subscribe for more content that tackles important issues and promotes positive change. Your support helps us continue bringing you stories that matter. Thanks for watching.